Let's jump right into this because today we're unpacking one of the most profound paradoxes of being human. If you really think about it, human survival is built on this incredibly delicate evolutionary balancing act. On one hand, you've got the physical longevity of our bodies, our literal ongoing battle against disease, the elements and predators. But on the other hand, we have this deep-seated, hardwired need for social connection. So today, we're going to dig into the data and the research to see exactly how our bodies and our minds evolved to keep us alive, and why those ancient survival mechanisms are still completely running the show in our modern lives.
Here's the roadmap for today. We'll start with Part 1, the quest for survival. Then we'll look at extending human lifespan. Next, we'll pivot to the threat of social death before uncovering why rejection physically hurts. And finally, we'll wrap up with our modern ancestral minds.
All right, Part 1. The quest for survival, a tale of two vulnerabilities.
Our ancestors walking the Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago faced two massive, constant threats to their survival. The first one is pretty obvious, right? The physical threats: disease, starvation, predators. But the second threat was invisible, yet honestly just as deadly. And that was the threat of being separated from the tribe. Because humans are fundamentally social animals, surviving all alone in the wild was virtually impossible. You literally needed the group to secure food and stay safe. Which brings us to this wild paradox today. Why is it that we can live more than twice as long as our ancient ancestors, completely conquering so many physical threats, yet we still feel actual physical pain from a simple social rejection? I mean, an ignored text message or a weird look from a stranger can totally ruin our day. Why? Well, to answer that, we have to look at our history through a dual lens, first tracking our physical bodies and then our social minds.
Moving into Part 2, extending human lifespan, our physical battle.
For millennia, humanity's main focus was just trying to improve our physical conditions, delay aging, and prolong our healthy lifespan. But as you'll see, the trajectory was definitely not a straight line up. If we look at early human ancestors back in the lower Paleolithic period like Homo habilis, they actually had an estimated lifespan of 52 to 56 years. Not bad. They were hunter-gatherers moving around constantly, eating diverse wild plants and meat. But then, fast forward to the 1800s, and life expectancy was down to just 28.5 years. It really wasn't until around 1950 that we jumped to a global average of 48 years, and then shot up past 66 years in the 21st century. So you're probably wondering, what caused that massive drop between our early hunter-gatherer days and later eras?
Well, the culprit is something called the Neolithic paradox. Around 10,000 years ago, humans stopped constantly moving and decided to settle down and farm. Now, logically, you'd think that being settled and having a stable food supply would make us live longer, right? Actually, scratch that. It was the opposite. In the Neolithic era, life expectancy plummeted to just 20 to 33 years. Settling down brought in massive new physical threats. Suddenly, we were living in super close contact with domesticated animals, which introduced these deadly cross-species diseases. We were basically living in our own waste, destroying our hygiene, and farming created all this standing water, which bred mosquitoes and malaria. It was a perfect storm.
Fortunately, we eventually cracked the code on the physical side of survival. Take Turkey, for example. Back in the 1960s, the average life expectancy there was 51.7 years, but by 2019, it had rocketed up to 77.7 years. That is a massive, unprecedented leap, and it perfectly illustrates this global trend. Thanks to the discovery of vaccines, penicillin, modern hygiene, and these incredible drops in infant mortality, our physical battle for longevity saw an exponential victory in just a few short decades.
And the craziest part is, we are not stopping there. Forecasting from 2050 all the way up to the year 2100, we can see that continued tech and medical advancements are going to absolutely push the upper limits of the human lifespan. Developed nations like Japan and Switzerland are projected to easily breeze past 90 years of average life expectancy. So the key takeaway here is, from a purely biological standpoint, we are absolutely winning the physical quest for survival.
Which brings us to Part 3. The threat of social death, the hidden ancient danger.
So here is the massive catch. Living a long, healthy life meant absolutely nothing to our ancestors if they got kicked out of their tribe. We really need to talk about ostracism. Ostracism is the act of being excluded and ignored by a group. Now, throughout human history, tribes have used this to control problematic members. But back in those ancestral hunter-gatherer settings, being permanently ostracized didn't just mean your feelings were hurt, it literally severed the social connections you needed to stay alive. If you were cast out, you couldn't gather enough food, you couldn't fend off predators, and you couldn't reproduce. Evolutionary psychologists argue that historically, ostracism was quite literally a social death sentence.
Because being left out was so incredibly deadly,
Natural selection heavily favored humans who could detect it instantly and avoid it. And as a result, our modern brains are intensely hypersensitive to even the most minimal cues of exclusion. We have this crude, hair-trigger evolutionary detection system that goes off like a fire alarm. Research actually shows that people feel the psychological pain of ostracism even when they are fully aware that a computer program is the one ignoring them in a game. Just someone avoiding eye contact with you on the street or a friend taking a little too long to text you back is enough to trigger your brain's ancient survival alarm.
Let's dive into part 4, why rejection physically hurts, the brain's shared alarm.
To our ancestors, a social injury was just as dangerous as a physical one. So, rather than building a whole brand new alarm system in the brain just for social threats, evolution simply hijacked the one that was already there. When researchers put people in functional MRI scanners and simulate ostracism, like giving them the silent treatment, something truly mind-blowing happens. The scans show activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC. Guys, this is the exact same region of the brain that lights up and processes the distress of a physical injury, like a broken bone or tissue damage. Your brain is literally registering betrayal and exclusion as a painful physical wound.
But there's a really fascinating twist here. Recent psychological studies note that social pain is entirely unique because it can be re-experienced when you dwell on the initial incident. Think about this in your own life. If you broke your leg 5 years ago, simply thinking about that broken leg right now doesn't suddenly make your leg throb in pain today, right? But if you recall a time you were deeply betrayed, excluded, or humiliated by friends years ago, your brain actually forces you to re-experience that acute pain right now, in the present moment. It's an evolutionary warning system that never really turns off.
Finally, part 5, our modern ancestral minds, psychological needs.
So how does this deep-seated fear of ostracism actually attack our fundamental psychology today? Well, research shows that when we're ostracized, it instantly thwarts 4 fundamental human needs. First, our need for belonging. Second, our self-esteem. We immediately feel devalued. Third, our sense of control over our social environment is completely stripped away. And fourth, our sense of a meaningful existence is threatened, which ties right back into that ancient social death fear. Because these core needs are so vital, our very first evolutionary instinct when we get ostracized is almost always to seek re-inclusion. We try to figure out what we did wrong, we hyperfixate on social cues, and we just desperately try to get back in the group's good graces so we can survive.
But when re-inclusion fails, the consequences are incredibly severe. Consider the vole model. Scientists use prairie voles to study social behavior because they form pair bonds and regulate their hearts very similarly to us. When researchers put prairie voles through just 4 weeks of social isolation, the animals don't just get sad, they experience literal physical breakdowns. They suffer from cardiac dysfunction, massive spikes in stress hormones, depression, and learned helplessness. It's an animal model that perfectly bridges the gap, proving how a purely social trauma causes devastating, measurable damage to our physical bodies.
Which leads us to a completely wild but entirely logical scientific finding. Can you take painkillers for a broken heart? Well, yeah. Studies actually show that regular doses of common physical painkillers like acetaminophen can effectively reduce the self-reported distress of social pain and ostracism. Because social pain and physical pain overlap in the brain's DACC, numbing the physical pain sensors simultaneously numbs the emotional distress of being left out. It just cements exactly how tangled up our physical and social nervous systems really are.
So we arrive at our final thought. As we saw earlier, humanity has made miraculous leaps in extending our physical lifespan. Through medicine and agriculture, we've pretty much conquered the ancient physical threats of predators and plagues. But I really want to leave you with this idea. We have these modern bodies living to 80, 90, and beyond, but we are still running on ancient hunter-gatherer software that is absolutely terrified of being left out of the tribe. We've conquered the ancient physical threats to our lifespan, but have we learned to conquer the ancient social threats in our minds? It's definitely something to think about the next time you feel that pang of pain when someone leaves you on red. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you in the next one.